Start the stream. Make sure we're doing what we're doing. Okay, that's not right. Channel. Chapter 4, Part 1. $9:30. Oh, okay. There we go. All right, great. One more time. Yeah. Roman Republic, right. So, as I mentioned, compared to this last test, the next one is going to be the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, and then just like the fall of the Roman Empire / like the early Middle Ages, which is still mostly just Rome stuff. So, for the most part, it's going to be a lot more thematically coherent. We're not going to be going all over, the classical world. Well, that's not entirely true. We will be going all over the classical world, but it'll all be Rome. Okay. So let's go way back. Prehistoric Rome, or prehistoric Italy, I should say. Competing city-states in northern and central Italy, which is north of where modern-day Rome is, and, north of where Rome would be. We believe, based on archaeological evidence and, anthropological data and whatnot, they may have come from Lydia, which is modern-day Turkey, Asia Minor, as it's also called. They traded with the Greeks because there was Greek coinage and some Greek style art and pottery found in this region from, again, way back. Again, though, this being prehistoric, so we don't have any actual written records of this era yet. But what is important is that this is when the Greek alphabet and culture was introduced into Italy, which is, again, important because, where did my mouse go? So we can start getting written record. So history can actually start for us. So as far as like what we're talking about physically, or geographically, up this way, Rome, again, located right here. The Latins, this was, well, we'll talk about them in just a minute. But these were the Etruscans. These were the folks that they had, each of these were city-states, again, much like with Greece, much like with Mesopotamia, where each city was its own thing, but they're connected via essentially a culture. But, there's no, like, overarching king. They're just kind of doing their own thing. But the Etruscans were pretty tough in terms of being like an expansive power. So, on to early Rome. Hey, look, we've got some geography, which is probably going to be important, just like we were having with all the other early civilizations. 7 hills around Rome. That's why anytime Rome was like referred to in ancient texts, it often had something to do with 7. They were settled by the Latin, which was that group to the south I showed you guys a moment ago, which were from the Indo-European group of people, so they were sort of related to the Greeks, but I mean, as much as, you know, we in America are related to the Greeks. You know, we're from the same basic branch of the tree, I suppose. Now, they claim that Rome was founded in 753 BCE, based on archaeological evidence. That's extremely doubtful. So obviously, you guys don't need to know that date. There is a date a little bit later on that I'll give you guys. The Romans, especially once Rome becomes like a republic and then an empire, like they really like to go back to their past and really make it mythic and grand. These are just some dudes like living on hills around a river throwing rocks at each other. Like this was barely above Stone Age. They're like, oh no, we founded Rome in 753. It's like you guys barely had a language back then. Again, it was founded on the Tiber River, very important river, hint, hint. Once again, rivers are important. Now, this was 15 miles from the Mediterranean, so they weren't right on the coast like, say, Athens was. But the Tiber River was navigable, and you could put a boat on the Tiber and sail down into the Mediterranean, and then you're out in the big open sea, more or less, at least for the ancient world, and you've got access to all that fancy trade. As I said, it was mostly just a bunch of clans setting up family groups on the hills, and then they fought each other a bunch. So again, it was not a cohesive city in 753 BC. That's garbage. The Romans really like, you know, their stories. I mean, it's a bit more mythical than, say, the whole, like, George Washington was so honest, he chopped down his father's cherry tree and couldn't tell a lie. It's like, that story's also completely untrue. It is spun from whole cloth. It came from nothing. But that's like part of our mythical past, even though it happened like 200-300 years ago at this point. Like, that's not that long ago. But, you know, they like their heroes. In fact, we'll get into some of their heroes here in just a minute. Here's a map of Rome. This is a little bit later, obviously, but you've got the various hills. Where's my mouse? You've got the various hills here. Mount Pensius, Aquarian Hill, Vimo Hill. Over here is the River Tiber, all that stuff. The Aurelian Wall, so this is like way late in the Roman Empire that the Aurelian Wall existed, because the idea of putting a wall around your city was seen as cowardly, or that like your army wasn't strong enough to keep the enemy away from your city. So yeah, the fact that this is here in this map means this is a much later image than, you know, Roman Republic era. But still, same basic idea. I mean, it's not going to change the hills and the river that much. So you've got, you know, the various temples and forums and whatnot. So it's pretty neat. I mean, and actually, I'm going to pull back again real quick. If you look at it, if you can not have your eyes crossed by all these hills like I do, so look at it and I have to blink. You look over here where all the buildings are actually built, you start to sort of see like how similar it is to a lot of, well, especially our federal capital, but like state capitals and stuff too, because we modeled a lot of our stuff on Rome. But we'll get to that more specifically a little bit later. So, on to the Etruscans. The first kings in Roman legend were Etruscan because, well, they They were the ones who actually founded Rome. The first being Romulus, hence the name of the city being Rome, because, well, Rome is the shortened version of Romulus. Romulus and Remus were supposedly brothers who were cast into the river Tiber and were rescued by a she-wolf and nursed back to health. So there's, again, all this weird mythical idea of, like, the first kings of Rome were literally raised by a wolf, and that's not an insult? I don't know. And it's, like, on the seal of just about everything in Rome is, like, this wolf. That's why as we'll see much later next semester, especially when you've got the different countries and they're represented by animals. Of course, here in America, it's usually the eagle. Britain has a lion for some reason. Italy is usually represented by a wolf.
Wasn't the lion for England because of that one king who had a pet lion and then that taxidermist messed up the skin?
Oh, yeah. I mean, maybe, or, Richard the Lionheart from back in the day, even though he was mostly French. Yeah, and then, you've got, of course, the Austrian, like, double-headed eagle, which is often depicted as, like, a scraggly buzzard in the propaganda images, which is terrible. But, yeah, so anytime you see, Italy in, like, 1800s, 1900s images, it's usually as a wolf, because even to this day, that's like their symbol. So, Etruscans created Rome, they drained the marshes, they promoted religion with temples, so a lot of the original structure of Rome was built by the Etruscans. They brought in a lot of wealth as they were trading in the Mediterranean, in particular with the Greeks, as we mentioned. We have examples of Athenian vases being found in Rome after the Etruscans showed up. Because again, before the Etruscans, it was these Latin people like living on hills and throwing rocks at each other. And the Etruscans came in and were like, hey, let's make this less of a swamp, and let's actually build buildings, and let's trade with people outside of people throwing rocks at each other. And again, archaeological evidence, we were able to find that there's vases from clearly Athens, and those don't just show up. So, the Etruscan dominance of Rome ended around the year 500 BCE, again, roughly-ish 500 BCE, with the expulsion of Tarquin the Proud, who was a Etruscan king. The Latin people rose up, the Romans, I guess now, rose up and kicked the Etruscans out. And there was this great hero, Horatius Cocles, who was credited with fighting the Etruscans while his soldiers destroyed the bridge behind him so that they couldn't get to Rome. Now, while this does sound like another mythical dude who never existed, and a lot of the images are really freaking mythical, I mean, he's being, like, protected by various divine figures. I mean, you've got Zeus, not Zeus, his brother, Poseidon over here hanging out to, like, make the river Tiber impossible for the Etruscans to cross. As far as the book says, Cocles existed. He was a dude. He was a soldier, or maybe like I don't know if necessarily a general, but he was like an officer who, there was this one particular bridge back into Rome, and because it was narrow, he fought to keep the Etruscans on one side. His men destroyed the bridge behind him, And then he jumped into the river and swam back to Rome. Like, he didn't die in this fight. He wasn't a martyr. He jumped in the river and swam back. And the reason why you can't cross a river in a battle is because if you're trying to cross the river and the dudes on the other side want you dead, they will be throwing spears at you. But the guys on the other side are your guys. It's not so bad. So it worked out. Horatius Cocles not only was a hero of Rome, but he wasn't a martyr, which is rare. Usually it's like, oh, they're this great hero. They died protecting Rome. It's like he was a great hero and he lived. Which also makes it feel like it's probably not made up, because if it would be a better story if he died protecting Rome. You know, it would be more dramatic. Or maybe I'm speaking from a British bias, because the British love their martyrs. All right. So now we have the beginnings of Rome. Rome proper, the Etruscans came in, they laid the foundation, they drained the swamps and made it where you could actually live there, not just on the hills, and the Romans were like, cool, thanks, get out. So let's discuss some of the culture of ancient Rome. So early Roman religion, very, very broad and vague. Belief in vague divine forces known as the noumena. Basically, everything you did had a really specific god that had to be invoked. So, if you were going to the store, you had to invoke god of whatever to safely get down the road and not being eaten by wild dogs. Of course, there was the god of childbirth and the god of drawing water out of a well and not getting eaten by wild dogs. There were lots of just real simplistic gods of everything to keep up with. It wasn't as personal and it wouldn't be what it would become, where all the gods had specific names and personalities, and Zeus was an asshole. Well, Jupiter specifically. Yeah. So this more mature form of polytheism, which again, just straight up stole from the Greeks, came around the 6th century BCE, so around, I'm trying to remember which way it goes in BCE. I guess that was 700 BCE? No, 500 BCE, because it goes the other way. Yeah, Cocles in 500, so this was 500 BC. In the 500s, they started working with the Greek pantheon. But just like with what we saw with Alexander the Great, they took the idea of, these gods are neat, we're going to just rename them. So they did. So gods like Jupiter and Mars were just reskins of Greek gods, Zeus and Ares in this specific case. Now some Roman gods were more specific to Rome. Some of them didn't directly link to Greece, but a lot of them did. In fact, I've got I don't know if it's this slide, but I do have a whole list of just Greek gods and then just the Roman reskin. Okay, here are some religious terms, which is to say, here are some Greek terms, wrong chapter. Here's some Latin terms you guys need to know. Here's the one I already mentioned to you guys. Inauguratio. What's that? It's literally an inauguration. Now, specifically, it's for the king. The augur, or a priest that has divine power, touches the king's forehead to transfer said power to the king. But it's literally inducting a king into their place of power. It's an inauguration. Like I said, we here in America, our founding fathers were massive nerds when it came to like the classical era, and they took all the stuff from the Roman Republic and Greece and mashed them together and made early America. So a lot of this is going to look familiar. You've got the auspicatus, which sounds like something you maybe never heard before, but if you look at it a minute, this is reading the auspices in the flight patterns of birds for divine will. If you've ever seen like a huge flock of birds, particularly starlings or other things that travel in, the word isn't flock. I think it's murmur specifically, where they move almost like a single entity, where just like one or two can turn and the whole group turns, and there are dozens, if not hundreds of them. That's usually what this is about. It's not like, oh, there's geese flying overhead this particular direction, it must mean this. This is like, the birds are doing something weird, the gods must be trying to tell us something. And this word is where we get the word auspicious from. If you're not familiar with that word, usually it's used for like, oh, this is an auspicious day, which typically is like it feels like things are going to go well. Usually, oh, it's something tells me today's going to be good, is usually what auspicious means. So it's pulled back a little bit from, the flight patterns of birds are telling us what the gods are up to, but it's still just sort of this general idea of how things are going to go. So yeah, auspicious is still a word we use. And again, so much of our language is Latin based anyway, because French is, but I'll get to that later as well. Anyway, here's the she-wolf and the babies. Something y'all are going to need to get used to going forward is the babies are always really ripped. Like, these babies are jacked. For some reason, babies are really muscular back then. She's very... maybe the wolves in Europe were different. I don't know. I have a whole thing about bears a little bit later. That's the murmur, where birds will move in such a way that they look like a single organism. This is what I believe they were talking about when it says flight patterns of birds, not like, just this morning a bunch of geese flew overhead. I feel like 4 or 5 geese flying overhead probably didn't count compared to something like this. This was probably pretty crazy. Oh, yes. And one of the images I found after initially making these PowerPoints, almost 10 years ago now, Romulus and Remus deciding what they're going to name the new city. And Romulus has a better idea. Now, I think according to the legend, obviously they both wanted to be the ones to rule the new city, and so they went to different they chose one of the 7 hills, or they each chose a different hill to go stand on and look out and look for an auspicatus and see what it told them. But Romulus did end up killing his brother over, who would be the one to rule the city. So, allegedly, these dudes never existed. But, yeah, these dudes. So, what do you expect from from that? All right. So into the early Roman Republic. Now, once again, if you have your hands on the book, there is, and I'll show you guys here in class, there's this whole like thing, this like diagram of how the different parts of the Roman Republic worked. You don't need to worry about that. There's 3 major sections of the way the political systems in the Roman Republic worked. We'll occasionally pull a few from here and there just to mention, but here are the 3 to talk about. So, you have the consuls. They were essentially the monarchic group. We'll talk about them more, each group more in a little bit, but they had like the highest level of power, but there was still checks and balances. So this was essentially like to bring it back to, say, the American system. This is your elective, not an elective. This is your executive branch. The consuls, there were 2 of them. They had their own section, and they technically ran things, but the guys who had the most power were the senators. And we just stole that wholesale. Now, they represented the oligarchic or aristocratic section of the various city-states in Greece. So, you had the various rich families, or the ones that own land, or the whatever high-class families that had power due to various reasons, and again, we'll get into that in a little bit as well. And they were the ones that ran the Senate. The Senate had a lot of power, and I think if they voted in a majority, they could override what the consuls were doing, but that was usually pretty tough to do. And then, eventually, you would get an assembly. And this was, once again, pulling the ideas from Athens. This represented the democracy or the people. It had less power than the Senate, but it still did have some power. They could still force some amount of change if they needed to. But again, we'll get into that more detail in a minute. But these 3 are the main 3 you need to know. The consuls are on top. There's 2 consuls. They share power, but they're limited to a 1-year term, which is kind of neat. It's like, hey, you get to have the power of a king. You share it with one other dude, and you only get it for a year. But for that year, you've got the power of a king. But also, again, you've got a dude that's like opposite you, who, if he disagrees with you, it cancels out. Usually that's not how the consuls work. Usually one consul would be out doing war stuff, and the other consul would stay home and do like boring paperwork stuff, and they would swap out. But technically, there were 2 consuls at any given time. I completely blanked on that. This is very similar to how the Spartans did. Because remember, Sparta had 2 kings that technically were kings, but they mostly did, outside the city, like diplomatic stuff. The consuls had more power than the Spartan kings did, but this is the same sort of where there's 2 of them sharing power rather than a single dude in charge. The Senate, literally the old ones, boy, that's that works out, doesn't it? Members of old important families, known as the patricians. There's another little Latin word I'm going to throw in there. I will be using that interchangeably with just the aristocracy. But the Senate did not have term limits. Again, boy, that sounds familiar. It'd be nice if senators had term limits. yeah, once you were a senator for life. And a lot of times, you just sort of were a senator by being a member of an important family. It was just assumed you were going to be a senator because that's what the important families did. And meanwhile, the assembly were the plebeians or plebs, the everybody else, common folks. And just like in Greece, they gained political voice because of the introduction of the phalanx infantry formation. Because prior to this, only horsemen, which is to say the aristocrats, were important in warfare, but a dude on the back of a horse can only do so much against a bunch of dudes who have shields and spears. And this was also before they had like stirrups when it comes to saddles, so it didn't take that much to knock a dude off a horse. Once again, here's a good diagram. Again, don't worry about the tribunes. I'll mention them briefly when we talk about some specific events. But just consuls on top, there's 2 of them. Senators, there's about 300 of them. Don't worry about the numbers either. Citizen assembly, which is just a lot of dudes. Now, this is something that I'm going to mention. So, you can see here, the plebeians are the ones in the sort of pink or like wine red, and the patricians are in the purple, the royal purple. One, I don't know why there's patricians in the citizen assembly, and I don't know why there's plebeians in the senators. It should be all citizens here, or all plebeians here, and all patricians here, but don't worry about that. This is how it's supposed to be. One consul is elected from the Senate, one consul is elected from the assembly. Is how it's supposed to be. As we're going to see going forward, the senators tended to dominate things when it came to consuls because they're the ones that had the power and they didn't want to lose any of the power they had. But we'll get to that. Okay. Speaking of plebeians and patricians, let's talk about plebeians and patricians. So again, patricians were the aristocrats. They were born into their status. Due to the phalanxes, they had to reassert their status because, oh no, all my benefits and prestige and power is not going away, but other people now have some things, and I feel threatened. So they started doing more things in order to gain more power. Supervised religious rites, which is a thing we saw in Mesopotamia. Led armies in battle, which I'll talk more about a little bit later. That was like a big deal because that was how you gained glory, which was almost like a currency in ancient Rome. They made the Senate stronger because obviously, of course, the people who have power are going to use the law to make themselves more powerful. Use clientage, which is something we'll talk about, I think here, in just a minute, should be on this slide. And use that to keep the plebeians in debt because we can't let the poor people have power. So the plebeians, you've got the regular folks. But again, it's not just like dirt farmers, and this is something we're going to talk about a lot as we get into the Middle Ages, and especially towards like the Renaissance era, is the lower class really starts to expand. The idea of a middle class doesn't exist until almost the Industrial Revolution, because the lower class was just seen as, well, that's everybody else, and they're not highborn, so they're just all the same. Well, not that much. You had your basic farmers. You also had merchants who were, running the economy. Again, they were growing the food. They were running the economy. They were the ones where you were getting all the soldiers now that you've got the phalanx formation. So they had to have some level of political voice, because again, they're fighting in the wars. You can't have people going off to war and not have some say in the government. That doesn't usually work real well. As I mentioned, one of the two consuls was supposed to be a plebeian to keep things even. That was sometimes the case, but as things got closer to the end of the Republic, the Senate was usually just running the show. Now, a plebeian could rise to the rank of noble if they had enough wealth and prestige, but they could never be a patrician. So, despite being able to be a, quote, noble, they could never be a patrician. And a family prestige means that your family has done a bunch over the years, and you've become wealthy enough that you are important enough to be seen as more than a mere plebeian. Which is to say, your grandfather was a consul once, and your uncle was a general in some battle, and your father was, part of the assembly, and maybe also did like war stuff, and maybe was also a consul. And also at this point, your whole family owns like this huge plantation of hundreds of acres, and at this point, Rome may decide to consider you slightly more than a basic commoner. So, upward mobility after several generations. But this is a big part of what we're going to see here in just a minute of how Roman society works. Is this idea of family prestige. You couldn't be born in a poor family and then rise to the top on your own. Your family needed to have been important to Rome for several generations. Again, and I'm just showing you this just to show you that there was more to how Rome worked than just the three, but you have a bunch of these dudes. There was an assembly that could also actually veto the Senate. That's the tribunes. We'll actually mention the tribunes a little bit. Magistrates, etc. But again, the big one, the Senate, the assembly. Where is the... Oh, there's the consuls. The two consuls with total rule. You got the praetors, censors, aediles, quaestors, etc. We'll talk about dictators a little bit later, which is not what we think of today. As I said, like with tyrants in my brain. Like with tyrants in Greece, it was initially considered a good thing. So, the way that Roman society worked was the extended family, the patriarchy, the idea of a family unit, but more than just like the nuclear family, not just like the mother, father, and the kids, but like the parents and grandparents and like the cousins and aunts and uncles and like the whole, extended family. Because especially if you're an aristocrat, you need to make sure that your whole family was doing good for Rome. And if you had a family member who was, say, a black spot on the family, you would sometimes get rid of them. So aristocrats had a given name, which is to say the name that you're given at birth, and a family name. So, the name of the family. So, for example, when we mentioned, I already forgot his first name. Is Horatius? Or, was not Horatio. Horatius Cocles. Yeah, Cocles was his family name. And as we get later on into Roman history, aristocrats would have like 3, sometimes 4 names to express their lineage, what families they were from, and families that had married, and sometimes even like great events or victories that they had had in their history or them personally, which we'll see again in the Punic Wars. So that's why if you ever see like an old Latin name, it's going to be really long. Familia, boy, that's a hard Latin word for you guys to remember. So the familia is the entire household, including the servants. So if you were working as a servant in one of these aristocrats' homes, you were considered part of the family. I mean, maybe not so much as, you were considered an aristocrat, certainly not, but you were protected as part of the family. So the paterfamilias, which again, any kind of Latin or even a Latin-based language, Spanish, French, Italian, etc. Pater typically means father or at least parent. Paterfamilias is typically the father or leader of the household, not technically or not specifically like the father of whatever nuclear family is there. It could be just like the oldest male figure or the most important male figure in the household, say a grandfather or an uncle, an older brother, whatever. And he was, he had the last say in whatever was going to happen. Now, typically, a father in this situation will be out doing stuff in the city, taking care of like political things. So the person who was usually in charge of the household was the mother, or materfamilias. Again, little bit of Latin for you there in case you haven't taken a foreign language. Materfamilias, mother of the household, in charge of everyday functions. So typically, anything that happened within the household would be under her purview. Obviously, the father could override anything she did because, again, patriarchy. But for the most part, she was in charge. She was in charge of the kids. She was in charge of the servants. She was often in charge of the finances. So it was more than just, staying at home and making babies. The mother of the household was often very busy, especially, again, like keeping the financial stuff straight. So this is the thing I mentioned earlier. I thought it was on the previous slide, but it's here. Clientage. So if you did not have a family, or the family that you were a part of was not a very, say, high-ranking family in terms of prestige, you could be adopted into another family via clientage. So you would seek out a patron who would, sponsor you, I suppose is the proper word. They would offer you money and protection and essentially make you part of their family, at least politically, so that now out in Rome proper, you can claim membership to this family. But what it did, while it made the client part of this more important family, gave them money and protection, it made the patron, the person who was giving money and protection to these clients, for one, it gave them more prestige because it means that they can afford to support these people that aren't even their blood family. But also it means that when an issue comes up in the Senate and they need votes, how do you think the clients are going to vote?
Same with mafia.
Yeah, exactly. The clients are going to, okay, the clients are going to vote with the patron. Now, again, it wasn't a massive deal in small numbers, but Rome rarely did things in small numbers. I don't remember if it's the end of this chapter or the start of the next, but we had there was a Roman general who took an entire legion, which is like 5,000 dudes, if I remember right, and made them all his clients. Which essentially meant that their loyalty was to him, not Rome. Now, he was still fairly loyal to Rome, but the fact that he made an entire legion his clients, people under him, beholden specifically to him, A, spoke to his power, but B, it was like he essentially owned that legion now. They worked for him and not Rome, which is terrifying. So, but before we get to all of that, it's just every time I get to clientage, I remember that bit. It's like, oh yeah, that one dude just like bought a legion. So, Rome was surrounded by aggressive neighbors, and it decided to respond by conquering everybody. A very Sparta thing to do. So they began expanding in the 5th century BCE. So that would be, I guess, 400s. So about a century after they became free, they decided to do their own thing. They conquered a couple places, did a couple of treaties. They took over the nearby Latin peoples, the region known as Latium. Don't want to say Latinum, wrong word, which again is that region to the south. Now, a region they really wanted to get rid of was the Etruscans, because if you recall, the Etruscans were the ones who had originally ruled Rome, and Rome's real weird about like ancestral grudges. And I'm using the current verbiage there. Rome is real weird about ancestral grudges. The Etruscans were fighting the Greeks at the time because why not? The Greeks had destroyed the Etruscan navy. So the Romans just had to deal with the Etruscan cities in Italy. So they were just rolling up the Italian peninsula, hitting Etruscan city-states. However, in 387, a band of Gauls, or Celts, whichever word you want to use, they're essentially the same. Well, okay, actually, it's not the same thing. Gauls are specifically from the region of Gaul, which is modern-day France. Celt is the culture of the region, which spread beyond Gaul. And I think I mentioned to you guys, when you think of Celts, you think of like Ireland. Well, the Celts never actually made it to Ireland. Their culture did, though, because they traded with the Irish, well, and the English. Well, they weren't English, the Anglo-Saxons. Because I took an entire class while I was in Ireland about the Celts. All like Celtic nobles were buried with chariots. There are no chariot burials in Ireland at all. There's like Celtic-ish pottery and like symbols and all this other stuff of the culture, but there's no chariot burials. And they had chariots in Ireland. It's not that they didn't, because there's reports of the Irish fighting like the Romans and stuff via chariot. But it wasn't that didn't actually spread to Ireland. But anyway, the Celts are basically all of northern and central Europe at this point. So the group comes down, hits Rome. Like the Romans had to flee the city because they just were not able to fight off the Gauls. They came back and repaired the city, but it nearly stopped the Roman expansion entirely. There is a little sidebar here in the book, 113 in mine, but again, I don't know what it would be in y'all's. Is Rome or Roman Veii, V-E-I-I? That's a city just to the northwest of Rome, which was a nice little city that the Romans had conquered pretty early on, and a lot of Roman senators were like, why don't we just move to Veii and just like not bother rebuilding Rome, because Rome was in shambles. It's like, let's just move to this city that we've already got. It's got the infrastructure we need. Let's just leave. But again, Romans are really persistent about like ancestral stuff, so they went back to Rome and they rebuilt it. And by 351, they had defeated the Etruscan city of Tarquina, which is actually where their kings had come from originally, such as Tarquin the Proud. So that was like a big morale boost for the Romans. So thus they continued their conquering of the Italian peninsula. But there was this big, and they will never forgive the Gauls. This was very nearly a bookend for Rome. There are several events that were very nearly a bookend for Rome. So here we have the expansion of Rome. We are like not quite here yet, but I mean we're the peninsula-ish. We're not quite all the way down here yet. We'll get to that in just a minute. Yeah, we've got most of Italy, and then obviously it spreads way beyond, but that we'll talk about that later. So, the Latin League, this was a group of Latin cities that Rome once had belonged to. Rome left and then defeated them and then disbanded them because it's just Rome, man. So, after defeating the Etruscans, I guess they decided that the Latins couldn't have their own thing, so they beat them as well. Then there was the Samnites. This was a mountain tribe that Rome fought 3 times between 343 and 290 BCE. That's a lot of pretty consistent warfare. Now, for the most part, when Rome conquered a region, like the Etruscans or especially the Latin League here, particularly the Latin League, because, I mean, they were Latins like the Romans were, they would more or less just absorb them into the Roman Republic. You're now part of the Roman Republic. You are now citizens. If you want representation, send people to Rome. That sort of thing. The Samnites, though, because they gave the Romans so much trouble for so long, once the Romans did finally defeat them, they enslaved the ones that survived. Not to say that there was no slavery in Rome before this point, but like as a punishment for giving the Romans trouble, they enslaved what was left of the Samnites. Now, this is where I will take a slight detour and mention our boy Cincinnatus. Now, because once again, it took them forever to deal with the Samnites, the consuls could not be relied on, but the consuls were supposed to be the monarchic group because, you know, it was just two dudes. One guy's supposed to go do the fighting, one guy stays home and does the paperwork. The consuls kept getting killed in battle. They couldn't get a real edge against the Samnites. So they realized that the Republic way of doing things was too slow. So this is where the dictators came in. And I don't have anything specific about dictators, so I'm just going to mention it to you guys now. In Rome, a dictator was elected. It was, hey, we have issues. We need one person at the top to make decisions, and we'll follow those decisions. This dude, Cincinnatus, who was a farmer, again, not some poor dirt farmer. He had like a plantation, but still, he was a farmer. And they said, hey, you don't know anything about warfare, but therefore you will have a fresh perspective on what's going on. We're going to stick you in the hot seat, and you can help us out. And apparently Cincinnatus knew what he was doing, and within like 2 months, they had defeated the Samnites. Now, I don't know if this was like the last big one or one of the 3 times that they fought. I don't remember where it was exactly, but he had done what he had set out to do. Now, he had done such a good job that they were like, you know, you've got a 6-month term. You can keep the 6-month term, and you know, you've done it in 2 or 3 months. You can have the rest of the term. Do whatever you want. You know, have a party, do orgies. I mean, we're Rome. But Cincinnatus goes to the Senate, hands them back the fasces, as they're called. It's the bundle of rods around an axe, which is the symbol of power. And he said, no, I'm going back to my plantation. I'm going back. It's like I've served Rome, and I'm going to go back and do my farming. And this example is what we would get much later on with George Washington after his 2nd term, I guess it was. And they were like, hey, nobody's going to vote against you. You want to have a 3rd? And he quoted Cincinnatus and says, no, I will go back to my farm. I've served my country. I'll go back to my farm, and you know, someone else can take the rods of power, however he put it. And that is while we have the city of Cincinnati. That's why it was named that, if you could tell by the name. There's a big statue of Cincinnatus in Cincinnati. And just like Cincinnatus, George Washington didn't actually work on this farm. He had slaves. But all that to say, that was how dictators were supposed to work. You call them in when you got an emergency. They do what they need to do. If they get done early, I mean, they can technically do whatever, But in the case of Cincinnatus, he was held up as like, this is what Romans aspire to be. They do what they can for their republic, and then once they're done, they go back to what they were doing, which in the case of Cincinnatus is growing food for the republic. So, yep. Now, in addition to Cincinnatus, all of this warfare made Rome have to do a little bit better than just phalanxes. The Romans evolved their military into legions. This was 5,000 to 6,000 men, broken up into what were known as maniples. I've got an image of a legion so I can kind of show you what they're talking about here. So they were rectangular formations, they were lines of dudes, but unlike what, say, you'd see in the Revolutionary War, where you'd have lines of dudes shooting at each other, and then like they would run around and then the next line of dudes would shoot. These guys would actually leave gaps after every certain number of men, so they could throw their spears, fight the enemy, and then once they were getting exhausted, they could back up through the gaps, and the next line could move forward and fight. And then when that group got tired, they could move back, and the next line could move forward. Because you got 5,000 to 6,000 of these dudes. You got plenty. So here is Rome again. Now, granted, this again goes a bit further than where we are right now, but so let's see, Roman and Latin territories. So the like awful lime green color here. Roman allies. So you've got up here. Do I have? Well, we're getting to 200, so we're probably not quite this far yet. So we're still kind of in this middle of Italy area at the current moment. Here we go. The manipular legion. Yeah, so you'd have the various groups piled up like this. Yeah, these guys would fight, and then when they would need to back off, they could back up, and these guys would slip in through the cracks and continue the fight. Again, they'd be bloody massive. They also had small cavalry units to support the flanks. And then the guys who had to back off after skirmishing would remain in the back as reserves just in case. And again, they fought similar to the phalanxes, where it's just a group of dudes with spears and shields. But it's a lot of dudes with spears and shields. And they've got backup. So it's kind of an expansion of the phalanx. Now there is a weakness to this, and we will go into that more next time, but it's really good at some things and not so good at other things. Now we can end it here. Yeah, that's fine. I mean, technically this is the last section in that section, but it's about the Greeks. And this does technically actually lead into the next war, so we'll do that. Yeah, we'll do that later. All right. I will see you guys. Today is Wednesday, isn't it? Monday.